We're starting chapter 6 today on percent, and it starts on page 183 of your textbook. You can see that the big idea is that you can use percent to compare quantities expressed per 100 of something. So make sure you're writing that down in your notes. So it should say chapter 6%, and you should have that as your big idea. It might be there for you already, that I can use percents to compare quantities. And you can see that per cent, we know that per means out of, and then the prefix or the suffix cent, wherever you see it, as in like if you had centimeter, we know that cent is 100. Or if you had dollars and cents, so this symbol signifies there's 100 cents in $1, so we know that cent is 100. And then I always like to tell my students that there's a little trick when you write the percent symbol, and you can see that there's 2 zeros and a 1 in between, so you can think of it as 100, and that reminds you that it's out of 100. Our objective for today is that I will be able to write equivalent fractions, decimals, and percent with at least 75% accuracy on my daily work. I know many of you would like it to be higher than that. Our test date this year will be on November 20. If that's different, then your teacher will let you know, and then you can write down your planner. Remember that math is, hopefully you said, the language of science. And science involves God's created world. Why it works is that math remains constant because God is faithful to uphold all things. We've talked about this since the beginning of the year. Percents show up everywhere. In shopping, you can calculate the item cost using rates, and then you can figure out what percent of maybe the total number of items you're buying that one item is. You can calculate tax. Tax is given to us in a percent of our total. So maybe your tax rate in your city is maybe 8.1%. So whatever you're checking out at the store with, you would multiply that times 8.1% to find out how much your tax is. Or to find your total bill, you could multiply it times 1.081 and get your total. We'll use it in real life when we track finances. You could use it when calculating your tithe at church. You're supposed to give 10%, so 1/10 as a fraction, or you could say 10%. Understanding loans is a percent of income, so when you're older, you can ask your parents now if you want more information, but debt to income ratio. So when you're applying for a loan, they'll talk to you about your debt to income ratio and calculate that as either a fraction or a percent. So percents are just another way to compare decimals or fractions as portions. Specifically, percents will be portions of 100. So you can use either fractions, decimals, or percents, and possibly ratios to compare different numbers. It really depends on the situation on which one you would use. So percents comes from Latin per centum, means by the 100. Therefore, we get out of 100 for our percent. Think of the root word cent, like we talked about. And we're going to use our God-given ability to observe aspects of numbers to find the percent of a number and compare that to decimal and fraction form. Remember, mathematical consistencies are upheld by God's faithfulness, and that works with percents as well. And in Jeremiah 32, verse 37, it says, "Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me?" So although our math problems might be difficult for us at this point, we know we can have a growth mindset and know that God will help us, but nothing's too difficult for God, including upholding all of the mathematical consistencies that we learn through. So I already talked about the different notations. You can use a fraction, decimal, percent, or ratio. Just depends on which situation you need. So we're going to talk about conversions. So percents can be converted into decimals, fractions, which could also be listed as proportions. They can also be converted to ratios, which I'll show you later. Percents can be thought of as a part or a whole, which we'll get into this chapter. And it really just depends on the problem. So from actual practice, what you're going to do is make a chart with 4 columns. And you're going to need to leave probably about 5 rows, 6 if you include the header row. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. So fraction, decimal, percent, ratio, 4 columns, and 6 rows if you're including the heading row. In the first row, you're going to write down an example. So the fraction would be 45 over 100, so 45 hundredths. Lots of times if you read your fraction out loud, the decimal becomes super easy, and you just write down 45 hundredths. We know this is the tenths place, this is the hundredths place. And then to get from the decimal to the percent, all I have to do is multiply by 100. So 45 hundredths, and I just move my decimal place, times 100 would be 45. And then I write percent for my label. And then I really can just look at the fraction out of 100 to get the ratio. And I could write 45 per 100, or 45 to 100, or 45 out of 100. We talked about that in the ratio chapter. So on the next line, I want you to write down in the decimal column 3 and 45 hundredths. So remember, to get from a decimal to a percent, all we do is multiply times 100, which means we move the decimal place to the right. So this should be 345%. And then to get from percent to fraction, I simply just write this number, 345, over 100. So it's the percent over 100. Or you can look at the decimal and say this is the hundredths place. So I have 345 over 100, but I don't put the decimal in. And then the ratio would simply be the numerator, which is 345. And then remember, it's look at the fraction over 100 to 100. And then it says to simplify, so we can divide here by 5. And this would be 69 to 20. And then if we went back to this one and simplified, it would be 9 to 20, dividing by 5 again. But you can still see that they're all equivalent there. So I'm going to let you try this one and see how you do. So 17%. So if I was multiplying here to get to the decimal, I would do the opposite, which is dividing by 100. So that should be 17 hundredths, because I would just move my decimal place 1, 2 times. And then if I say 17 hundredths, I can get my fraction by just reading it, 17 hundredths, which then I can get my ratio of 17 to 100, which I can't simplify because this is prime and this is not a factor of 17. Okay, this one might be a little tricky because we're starting with a ratio that is not out of 100. So I have to get to something out of 100. So I need to make it an equivalent ratio, but my number needs to be 100 here. So I multiply it times 4, and then I get 196 over 100. So I know I can go to my fraction, because then when we converted up here from fraction to ratio, that worked. So 196 over 100. And then we're going to have a refresher to 4th and 5th grade. And earlier this year, if I have the hundredths place, that stops right here. So remember, this is where you can write backwards, and I can fill in the 6 first, and then 9, and then the 1. And I get 1 and 96 hundredths, which is equal to 196. And then to get to the percent, I just multiply by 100, which would be 196%, which works because we said the 17% just gets written as the numerator, so 196 would be 196 as the numerator. Okay, you try and do the last one. Pause the video a second, give you some time to work. And those should be the answers you should have. So that's just how you would convert fractions to decimals or decimals to fractions, and then to percents and vice versa, and to ratios. So you can convert all the way between those. Okay, and then we're just going to move on to understanding percent notations, which is percent as a symbol. That's all that means. So it's just a format rather than ratios or decimals or fractions. So we're going to write fractions and decimals as percents. So right here, this section is to take a percent as a fraction. So remember, this isn't anything new because you just did this on this side. You just moved a percent to a fraction. Really, all you did was when you had the percent as a fraction, you just wrote the percent over 100 and you removed the percent. So if I have page 187, number 4, it says we have 55%. So I just take the 55, the number, and put it over 100, because percent means out of 100. And then I simplify. So I could divide both of these by 5 and get 11/20. So you guys practice on number 5. You get 108%. So that's 108. It's an improper fraction, so you need to simplify. And I have 1 and 2 25ths. So it's an improper, and I would need to change it into a proper fraction. So the steps is simply just to put a percent out of 100. Okay. Next one is to write the percent as a decimal. Which again, you just did over here. We took the percent and wrote it as a decimal. Oh, look, on this one, what did we do? We divided by 100. So really all you're going to do is divide the percent by 100. So there's two different ways. You can change the percent to a fraction, or you can just divide by 100. So page 187, number 1, I have 8%. So 8, if I divide it by 100, I'd go 1, 2, and I'd get that. Or I can change it to a fraction and put 8 out of 100, which is equal to the decimal of 8 hundredths. Okay, you guys can try number 8. We have 126%. So you could either write 126 over 100, or you can try the dividing percent by 100 by moving your decimal point. Either way, you get 1 and 26 hundredths.